Hello everyone. In today's class, we will be discussing about the Kubernetes services. So in an earlier class, we have seen that we have created a deployment object, and creating a deployment object is not enough for exposing that to the outer world. In a previous class, we have created a deployment object with the command this kubectl create deployment. After creating a deployment, if we try to access service, the Iron Fist service with Postman, we will not be able to access it because by default, the deployment object and a pod objects are hidden from the outside of the cluster, and these pod needs to be exposed with the outer world with the help of the services. That is another Kubernetes object, and we have to leverage the capability of the services to allow pod to be exposed to the outer world. When we create a pod, this pod exposes the IP. This IP cannot be used for a specific reason. The one of the reason is when we create a pod, and it generates the IP that is known to the cluster and it is unique in that cluster. But this IP address may get changed when the pod is removed, or where, for example, in auto scaling or something, some certain pods gets removed, certain pods got added. When the pod gets removed, the IP address will also get removed, and when the new pod gets generated, this new pod may have the different IP address. So we don't have a IP address that is consistently available for the pod to be used. That is why we cannot use these IP addresses outside of the cluster. So Kubernetes has a way to expose the pod, and that is service. So the way we can create the service is create service, and if we check the help, we should be able to get a detail about that. So if you look at this, there are various ways. One of them is a load balancer service, another is a node port service, another is a cluster IP service. So these are the different way we can create the services. So let's say the cluster IP. So when we create the cluster IP with the help of the create service, what will happen is these service will be available and will be exposed only inside the Kubernetes cluster. It cannot be used outside of the cluster. For example, if I want to expose this API to the outer world, in this case, this cluster IP expose uh, services expose the pod using the cluster IP may not be helpful. Another way is the node port. Node port is something like using the IP address for exposing services, very similar to the cluster IP, but most of the times we don't use the node port because many a times the IP address keeps changing and we may have to keep on updating that. The another option is a load balancer. The load balancer, what it does is it helps to expose the IP to the it helps to expose the deployment object to the outer world. So the way it happens is we can use these services. We can say that kubectl create a service and load balancer, and then the deployment object name, that is Iron Fist, and then I need to provide what is the IP that I want to expose. So the TCP equal to the internal IP is 8081 and I want to expose to the same IP. So I can do like this and hit enter. Load port TCP, uh, something is wrong. I think maybe this is 2 times. Yes, correct. So if we do that and if we get the services, we should be able to see the service. This Iron Fish service has been exposed to the outer world using the 8081 and we can access using the local host. So let us go back to the Postman and see are we able to access our Iron Fish services. And yes, see we are able to ac- access this service with the help of the service object. Another way we can expose the service is using the expose command. So there is another command kubectl expose and the deployment, and deployment name is Iron Fist, and the type of which type of service I want to use, the load balancer, and what is the port I want to expose. The port is 8081, and if I try to run, it creates the service again and kubectl get services, kubectl get services. Sorry about that, there's misspelling. And now again, if I go back to the Postman, I should be able to run my service. So there are two different ways we can expose our service. One is using the service create service and another is expose deployment. Again, let us have a little bit closer look at a type of services that Kubernetes offers. So I went into the Kubernetes documentation and over there is a cluster IP. So cluster IP exposes the services on the cluster internal IP. Choosing this service makes the service only reachable from within the cluster. So this service will be available only within the cluster. We cannot access it outside the cluster, and this is the also the default type that if we don't specify any type, then this will be the default type. Another is a node port type, and this is also very similar to the cluster IP, but it uses the node's IP at a static port. So most of the times I have never used this node port, but it can be there can be some use cases for which we can be used, but I'm not much aware of that. Mostly I have used the cluster IP and the load balancer. So load balancer exposes the service externally using the external load balancer. The Kubernetes does not directly offer a load balancing component. You must provide one, or you can integrate your Kubernetes cluster with the cloud provider. So our as we are running it locally into Docker desktop, Docker Desktop also offers the load balancer. If you go to the uh, some service providers like GKS or EKS or something, they also provide the load balance services. That is why we only can use. So Kubernetes by default does not provide any kind of load balancer on its own. So this is all I wanted to talk about Kubernetes services. So, in a coming lectures, we will be exploring more about the pods and services. This is the declarative way we have done it. Now, in a coming lectures, what we will do is we will use the Kubernetes manifest file for creating the deployment object, creating the service objects, and everything. So, thank you very much for watching this video, and please stay tuned. And the more videos are coming. Thank you very much.